We're diving into a really significant shift in New York City politics today, the election of Zohran Mamdani. Now, he identifies as a democratic socialist, but critics are already calling his win a kind of Trojan horse victory. They say it was powered by, well, a pretty unusual mix of political activism and institutional money. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to look closely at the financial data, the political structures behind his rise. We're focusing on how this radical ideology fused with significant institutional money, including taxpayer dollars, to fuel the campaign.
Yeah, it's fascinating. When you dig into the data, you see this complex political machine emerge. Mamdani is, yes, a democratic socialist.
Yeah.
But opponents frame his victory very specifically as this red-green convergence. And we've got sources showing that a really key nonprofit, one tied to his political mentor Linda Sarsour, the Arab American Association of New York, or ANU, received, get this, more than $4 million in taxpayer money just between 2017 and 2024. And this happened while the organization's total revenue was just exploding. It topped $2.5 million by fiscal year 2024. So we really need to connect those dots, the rapid money growth, the activist groups involved, and Mamdani's quite radical policy plans.
Wow, $4 million in public funds. That's a number that jumps out.
Especially the taxpayer part.
Yeah.
So let's start with the red side of things, the ideology, the economic plans. Mamdani's been with the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, since 2017. And one source actually called him New York's first avowedly Marxist mayor. That signals a pretty major ideological shift for the city's leadership.
It does.
And the sources describe this red-green idea as basically Marxist ideology meeting Islamist, anti-Western, and anti-Zionist positions. Critics argue that what holds this alliance together is this shared opposition to global capitalism, Western liberalism, and Zionism. And when you look at his actual economic policies, they are a fundamental break from, traditional New York democratic ideas.
Okay, and the biggest red flag for fiscal watchdogs seems to be taxes, right? He proposed raising taxes on corporations and also on individuals making over $1 million a year. What did people predict would happen?
Well, critics warned his whole platform added up to a massive $10 billion tax hike. They basically argued that this kind of move would just push high earners and businesses out. They decamp to Florida, as one put it. It's a really aggressive fiscal strategy. It's not just about revenue. It feels like it's aimed at restructuring wealth.
And it goes beyond just the top earners, too. It seems to target basic market structures in the city, housing, local businesses. We're talking universal rent control. And opponents, especially housing economists, predict that leads straight to housing decay, abandonment, fewer places for anyone to live.
Absolutely. And then there's wages.
Yeah.
He supports pushing the minimum wage way up to $30 an hour by 2030. But maybe the most surprising bit of state intervention is his plan for grocery stores. He wants to operate 5 municipally owned grocery stores, one in each borough. Opponents are saying this would just crush private small businesses. They specifically mention, the hundreds of independent bodegas that are so vital in many neighborhoods.
So it's a clear, pretty radical economic vision. Critics say it's leaning towards state control. How does that same approach show up in public safety?
It translates into what some sources call a philosophy of dismantlement. Mamdani's public safety plan is straight out of the DSA's prison abolition playbook. He actually signed on to the agenda for decarceration. That calls for ending cash bail, decriminalizing drug possession and prostitution, and pledging no new jails, period.
And what about actual policing on the streets? He wants to replace it with a new Department of Community Safety, staffed only by civilians. Opponents didn't hold back on that one. They called it a backdoor code word for continuing to defund the police. And I guess given his history, he supported defunding the NYPD before, called the department racist. It seems clear the goal isn't just reform, it's replacement.
Exactly. The sources really paint a picture of someone aiming for revolutionary change, not just tweaking the system. Okay, so now let's pivot to that green network, the money and the organization that sources say gave him the muscle to win.
Right, and that brings us straight to Linda Sarsour. She's been his political mentor since at least 2017, and her relationship with him seems quite revealing about the campaign strategy itself. She apparently said publicly that Mamdani intentionally downplayed his pro-Palestine views during campaigns to appeal broadly. That sounds tactical.
Well, she presented it as being strategic, pragmatic.
Yeah.
And then right after he won, Sarsour made this public vow to stay outside the administration. Why? Specifically so she could keep pressure on him, make sure he followed through on his radical promises on policing in Israel. She's like the outside anchor, keeping him tied to the activist base.
And a huge part of that base is her former organization, the Arab American Association of New York, ANY. Let's talk about their finances, because the growth numbers are kind of staggering. Their total revenue just shot up from around $485,000 in fiscal year 2014 to over $2.5 million by FY 2024. How does an organization grow that fast in a decade?
Yeah, that exponential growth is definitely one of the big surprises in the financial docs. And when you look at where that money came from, it's very concentrated. Their revenue is overwhelmingly from contributions, like 99 to 100% in recent years. And crucially, for most years reported, they show almost $0 coming from program services. So that structure suggests they're relying almost completely on grants and donations, not really earning income from providing specific services.
Okay, and this is where the taxpayer money comes back in. We mentioned earlier, between 2017 and 2024, ANY got over $4 million in public funds. That breaks down to $3.3 million from New York City, $854,000 from New York State. Is that level of public funding typical for nonprofits that are also pretty politically active?
Well, the sheer amount is notable, for sure. But what's maybe more concerning, at least to watchdog groups, is a lack of transparency around some of it. Groups like Open the Books, they flagged a lot of that $3.3 million from the city as being untraceable to a specific agency. And when you can't trace public money back to the department that gave it out, well, critics say that points to an opaque system, one where it's potentially easy to reward political allies using discretionary funds.
So public money flowing into AOI, check. But the campaign also got major institutional support beyond that, right? From groups linked to AIAC?
That's right. The Council on American-Islamic Relations, Sarsour herself actually boasted about this. She said the CAIR Unity and Justice Fund, PAC, was the biggest institutional donor to a pro-Mamdani PAC. Public records back that up. This specific PAC funneled $120,000 into the pro-Mamdani effort. It really shows how organized institutional money was leveraged for a very specific ideological win at the city level.
Okay, let's talk about some of the controversial alliances that seem to define this political network. ANY, the group we just discussed, with all the funding they actively lobbied for Mamdani's Not on Our Dime bill. What exactly was that bill trying to do?
Basically, it aimed to stop New York charities from funding Israeli communities located in the West Bank. Critics saw it essentially as a form of municipal BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions, but implemented through local city policy. And then remember, after October 7th, 2023, ANY was reportedly a key organizer for the Flood Brooklyn for Palestine demonstration.
And Mamdani himself has documented connections to other, let's say, highly controversial activist groups, too. Sources mention ties to Within Our Lifetime, or Wool and its founder, Nurdin Kiswani.
Yes, Wool and Kiswani. They're known for using slogans like globalize the intifada.
Yeah.
That's rhetoric that critics, really across the board, see as normalizing violence against Jews. The sources also point to this specific instance where Mamdani apparently praised Imam Siraj Wahhaj, who was an unindicted co-conspirator in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, calling him a pillar of the community.
Wow. So this mix of radical policies and these kinds of networks, it leads directly to questions about governance, doesn't it? Critics are warning that Mamdani, who some describe as an unqualified amateur because he doesn't have a ton of prior governing experience, now controls a $100 billion city budget. That's just a massive amount of responsibility.
It's a huge shift, yeah. The sources we looked at see his election as establishing a really significant beachhead for this red-green alliance within American city governance. And for New York City specifically, home to the world's second-largest Jewish population. Well, normalizing anti-Zionist talk and policy at the city level raises some immediate serious concerns. Concerns about anti-Semitism, security, and maybe the erosion of traditional pluralist values. According to these critics, the fundamental political goal here isn't gradual change, it's revolutionary change, directly challenging the city's liberal democratic roots.
So, okay, boiling it down. What does this all mean for, say, the average taxpayer in New York? This deep dive seems to show that this revolutionary platform elected in New York is really closely tied to very specific ideological funding streams, and that includes millions in taxpayer dollars going straight to groups with documented radical anti-Western and anti-Zionist positions. It looks like a political machine built, partly anyway, on the public dime.
And that raises a really important question for you, the listener, doesn't it? About accountability, about transparency. The DSA platform, which Mamdani is part of, it pushes for huge government intervention state ownership, defining equity as equal outcomes, not equal opportunity. Seeing this ideology move into city power, especially combined with this opaque public funding, well, it signals a pretty big shift in how urban governance might work.
And it's interesting, too, that both Mamdani and Governor Kathy Hochul have apparently refused to say if Ainwise rather generous city and state funding will continue under this new administration.
Right. So as this administration actually takes office, the big question remains, how closely will citizens, will watchdog groups, need to watch the flow of public discretionary money, especially to political and activist groups whose stated mission is the radical transformation of our institutions? Financial transparency for these government contracts seems more critical now than ever, just to make sure public money isn't accidentally or purposefully bankrolling radical political change.